Assalamu alaikum, boys. I hope we're all doing okay. This is our second video on Salah al Din al Ayyubi, and we're just going to continue with it. I know a lot of you guys have probably already learned about him or spoken to your parents about him, and I'd love for you guys to do that to get more information. We're going to finish this book this week, and then we're going to start on a novel about Salah al Din. It's about his life, but it has a little bit more talking. Okay. So where we left off, Salahuddin's father had just got the job working for Sultan Zengi. Sultan Zengi was a Turkish sultan, and his father just got the job right now to work with Sultan Zengi. Okay, so a few years later, Salahuddin and his family, they moved again, this time to Baalbek. Baalbek is a city in Lebanon, okay? And then to Damascus, Damascus, right? And this is the capital of Syria, okay? By age 7, Salah al Din attended school at a mosque. So, a lot of times they want to talk about how education has been, okay? But in the masjids of those days, people used to go there, especially young boys, they would go into the masjid and they would learn everything. So while he was in the masjid and he was learning the Quran and he was learning about his deen, but aside from that, he also learned about science, math, poetry, philosophy, religion, which is the deen, and he learned the history of the Arabs and the culture of the Arabs, right? So he learned a lot of things inside the masjid. And so, if anybody ever talks to you about the history of Islam, know that I want you guys to all know that we've always had schools, whether they were schools like Hayat School or they're schools like in the masjid. Okay. His interests generally lay in intellectual rather than military pursuits. So he liked to think about things, right? That's what intellectual means, right? Salahuddin grew up learning about his religion and following the 5 pillars of Islam: faith, iman, prayer, salah, fasting, saum, the giving of alms or the zakah, and the pilgrimage, the hajj. So he learned about these things, right? The Muslim society placed a strong emphasis on leading a spiritual life, having a personal connection with Allah, and purifying one's inner self. And we still have this today. You know that anytime you're in salah, anytime you're sad about something or you're worried about something, you can make dua directly to Allah. You don't need somebody else. So this is what Salahuddin was taught growing up. Religion was not a superficial practice. Instead, it was a living reality that involved embodying principles such as justice, generosity, love, mercy, nobility, and humility. And these words, justice is like adl, generosity is karam, love is guys, you guys know what love is. Mercy is rahma, nobility is sharaf, and being humble is when you walk around and you're not arrogant and you're not picking on people. These are all things that are part of our religion, and these are things that Salahuddin was taught, and it made him a great leader. Okay, so these are the 5 pillars of Islam. You guys all know them: faith, prayer, fasting, almsgiving, which is zakah and sadaqah, and then pilgrimage, which is hajj. Salahuddin's life changed when Zengi's son, Nur Al Din, assumed control of part of his father's kingdom after Zengi died in 1146. So Salahuddin is born in 1138. He's about 8 or 9 years old when his father's boss, Sultan Zengi, dies, and a new sultan is there. The new name is Nur Al Din. Salahuddin's father became the governor of Damascus. So they went to Damascus. And Salahuddin's uncle, Shirkuh, became a military general. Salah al Din joined Nur Al Din's army at age 14. So at 14 years old, he's part of the army, okay? And assumed the role of the Sultan's chief aide a few years later. So a few years later, he became basically the helper for the Sultan. Nur Al Din became Salah al Din's role model. The mithal for him, somebody he can follow and copy and act like. The Sultan was rich and powerful, but he led a simple, honorable life and used his wealth for the benefit of his people. So he wasn't like the kings in Robin Hood. He was a very generous man. Nur Al Din believed that every man was equal, and he ruled with fairness and generosity. Salahuddin vowed to become the same kind of man. Taking command. The citadel of Salahuddin in Cairo, in Kahra, was built on Salahuddin's orders between 1176 and 1184 for protection from the Crusaders. So this is like a fort that he made in Cairo. Okay, Salahuddin continued to learn and eventually assumed more of a leadership role in the military. During his late 20s, he traveled to Egypt on several military expeditions under the command of his uncle Shirkuh, for the purpose of preventing Egypt from falling under Frankish control. Egypt was in a state of political turmoil, and its ruler, called a vizier, kept trying to get Muslims and Franks to fight each other so he could avoid fighting either group. After Shirkuh's forces repeatedly drove out the Franks, Shirkuh decided that he wanted to take over Egypt. The vizier planned to have Shirkuh assassinated, but Egypt's religious leader viewed Shirkuh as a liberator and made him the new vizier. Shirkuh became ill and died only 9 weeks later. So at age 31, Salahuddin rose to become the new vizier, as well as the new commander of Egypt's troops in 1169. So what happened? His uncle was the boss in Egypt, but he died after 9 weeks. So Salahuddin had to take over. Now I'm just going to go back to the map for a second. I'm going to explain. Boys, at this time, all of the Muslims were not together, kind of the same way that we are today. In Iraq, you had the Abbasids. The Abbasids were running Iraq, okay, and we had a Khalifa from there. And then in Egypt at the time, we had a group called the Fatimids, okay, and they were Shia, and they were running in Egypt, and the Abbasids were in Iraq, and then we had different groups in Persia, in Iran, we had different people there, and then in Turkey we had a different group of people. So the whole Muslim ummah at the time, even in Spain, the Umayyads were there in Spain, and all the Muslims were separated. They were not together. Because they were not together, they were not working together to fight against the kuffar. So we're going to learn about this, but my question to you guys today, I have two questions, you have to answer them, is how do you think um, the separation between the Muslims at this time led to Jerusalem being taken over by the Christians? Okay, and then the second question is a personal question. Salahuddin was influenced by Nur Al Din, and he learned how to behave and learned from his example. I want you to think of somebody in your life who has set an example for you in a way that makes you want to behave the same way. Maybe your father, maybe your grandfather, maybe the sheikh in the masjid, maybe it's somebody you know but you haven't met, somebody famous, anybody who in your life you've seen them, and from their behavior and from the things they taught you, you want to behave like them. Okay, so we want to talk about one person who influenced your life and how you think the Muslim ummah being separated at a time led to the Christians taking over. Okay, all right.